For taking the time out of your day to, answer questions for all us geeks out there. Really appreciate it.
Oh, it's a pleasure and an honor.
Well, thank you. My question is probably going to be kind of a newbie question. I'm definitely an initiate geek, not a seasoned geek like you and Reuven and John Felix and all those guys. So, anyway, I was reading earlier about why the Gospel of Peter got kind of thrown out of the canon as a candidate for the canon. According to what I read, it was kind of due to, like, I guess Eusebius was saying that Serapion was saying that it was teaching Docetism, and that was one of the major reasons that they threw it out. But I also read that the decision on whether or not it was docetic was kind of hinged, or whether Docetism should be allowed in the canon period, kind of hinged on something in the Gospel of John, which is, and the Word was made flesh. And I was just wondering if there's more to it than that, as to why, if it all really hinged on just that. And then more in general, how many of the major doctrines of Christianity, not just Christology, but in general, hinge on only one or a few passages, and how many have a more systematic basis throughout, the epistles and the gospels, etc.
Oh, yeah, it's really good. I also think what Eusebius said, that this Bishop Serapion said that it seemed to teach Docetism, and I believe the only evidence he adduced was that it said that when Jesus was on the cross, he appeared not to feel any pain. And that could indeed imply Docetism, but it's certainly equivocal, because it may simply mean that Jesus was stoic in his suffering, which seems to be the point of quoting Isaiah in connection with the Passion, like a lamb before its shearers is dumb, so he openeth not his mouth. So it could just mean heroic stoicism, the strong silent type. So it could be Docetism, but certainly wouldn't have to be. And it's a little surprising that if that's all there was to it, that they disqualified the thing on that basis, because you could certainly find other things that sound equally possibly docetic elsewhere, like in Luke, for instance, where he is hustled to the ledge of the brow of the city of Nazareth to be thrown over, and yet he just walks through the crowd and escapes. Like, you could say, again, I mean, this is almost exactly parallel to the Gospel of Peter thing. You could say, like Bill O'Reilly does, that it was just the force of his personality, that he stood there and said, which one of you guys wants to be the first, or something, but and that they just kind of melted away, intimidated by him. Could be. But it could also be that it assumes he had a kind of phantom body and drifted away from him. Things like that are mentioned in the Acts of John, in the part called the Preaching of John, where John recalls how sometimes he would reach out to touch Jesus and his hand would go right through as if he were made of smoke. Other times he would tap him on the shoulder and it would be like he was a steel robot. And so he has no true form. So, you could take the Luke thing that way just as easily. And there's some other ones too. Like, how about in John? You mentioned the Word became flesh. But there's an odd thing going on in John, in that they can't seem to decide whether he's flesh or not. Even in that statement, it says the Word was made flesh and literally tabernacled or pitched his tent among us, which suggests that it's like he was here and gone quickly. How much of an incarnation is that? Or in chapter 4, where he says to the Samaritan woman, "Give me a drink," and then the whole dialogue ensues. Well, presumably he's thirsty, and people point to that and say, well, you see, he was a flesh and blood man, he got thirsty. But when the disciples come back with a bag of groceries, they say, "Master, eat." And he says, "I have food to eat that you know nothing of. My food and drink is to do the will of him who sent me." What, he doesn't need to eat? Or on the cross, this shows he was real and really suffered when So he says, I thirst. But then immediately the evangelist says he just said that because he had to fulfill Scripture. Was he not really thirsty? And there's stuff like that, or like in chapter 20, Thomas says, I'm not going to believe he rose unless I can put my hand into the wound and all that. Well, Jesus appears and says, okay, go ahead. He doesn't. What's going on? And I tend to think it's because the Gospel of John circulated through both sides of the dispute we read of in First John, where there were some who believed Jesus had not come in the flesh and others who did. Well, my guess is both of them had some version of John. One was consistently docetic, the other one was consistently anti-docetic, and long after the battle died down, some scribe harmonized both versions. So you have it pointing in different directions, one of them docetic. So who knows? I mean, if that's the only thing that kept Peter out of it, that seems pretty picky. My guess is it's just that like Serapion had to borrow a copy of the Gospel of Peter. He didn't know what it said until he did, so he didn't grow up hearing that one read. If he had, he probably wouldn't have seen docetism in it any more than he did in Luke or John. So that's what I think on that one. It's even more interesting what you say about it. Are there doctrines that hang by a thread? Well, would anybody believe that, would anybody feel obliged to believe that when Moses died, Satan and the archangel Michael were haggling over who would get his body? If that didn't appear in one verse in Jude, I think it's a pretty safe bet they would not. So there are some like that. Maybe the most famous one would be the doctrine of the Trinity, which, if that passage in 1 John 5 were legit, there are three that bear witness in heaven: the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one. Okay, you might have a biblical basis for the doctrine of the Trinity, but of course that's a late insertion. So contrary to what apologists say, it's not the case that any major doctrine does not rest on textual criticism. They can be threatened that way. You could even wonder if there's any clear basis for the doctrine of justification by faith in the Lutheran sense. I think there is one passage in Romans that could be read that way. The thing about Abraham, that if you work for a wage, that's not a matter of grace. That does sound like you're trying to earn your salvation, though it wouldn't have to. Whereas all the other passages about works of the law seem to have to do with a whole different question, whether Gentile converts to Christianity are obliged to keep the ceremonial laws of Judaism. And so there again, I mean, that's the whole Reformation. Is that really taught in any place but this one passage about Abraham? And is it really even taught there? And I guess, or hell, some of the references there to Hades and Gehenna and so forth don't necessarily teach a conscious hell of torment. I think the only place it unequivocally does is in the book of Revelation, and there it's limited to those who have taken the mark of the beast. Did it intend everybody who was an unbeliever would get that treatment? We don't know. And so if the whole doctrine of hell is suspended on that, forget it. Or one last one, the opposition to homosexuality, saying that the Bible's against that. Is it really? The only unambiguous passage is in Romans 1, where we think it's a general condemnation of male homosexuality, but there's even debate about that. The other passages are not really even about that. So there are some important things that I think hinge on a particular interpretation, dubious but possible, of a single verse. I probably shouldn't go on at such length. I'll try to...
Oh, I love all the information. Would you mind if I asked a quick follow-up?
Fine with me.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I was just wondering if we have any information on, because you mentioned that the Gospel of Thomas, we know that, Serapion was saying that it was docetic because of that passage you mentioned. Do we know, like, is there any evidence or information on what the Gospel of Peter community believed about the gospel? Like, do we know if they were docetic, or is that just kind of Serapion's kind of feel of that particular passage in that gospel?
What it says that he had to borrow it from a church that used it, and it sounds like it was something he would have considered heresy. I forget who he said it was, but I've always taken it, I have to look at it again, to mean that they were docetic. But then that only means if this one passage was the only sticking point, that they read it that way. It's not clear that it's intended that way. But I don't know if we know any more about the group.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for the question.
Well, I have a question on Thomas. In the commentary, I believe it was, or maybe it was in something else, you wrote that Thomas lacked the Gnostic distinctives, by which I believe you meant any reference to the classical Gnostic myths. So exactly what is the relationship between the Gospel of Thomas and Gnosticism? Is it legitimate to say it's Gnostic in any way, or is it pre-Gnostic or proto-Gnostic?
I would say there is Gnostic or proto-Gnostic material in it, like the doctrine of pre-existence of souls, and one or two other things maybe. I'm not, or the living one and all that could be compatible with Gnostic notions of the spiritually dead versus the enlightened. The secretiveness that in saying seven, I think, make a comparison and tell me who I'm like. That certainly seems to reflect the secrecy of Gnostics, who knew they could be risking their lives to admit what they really believed. But I think the Gospel of Thomas is a collection of material from different groups. There's stuff that seems to me definitely to point in a Jewish Christian direction, like the idea that James is going to be the caretaker once Jesus leaves. The idea that if you don't keep the Sabbath as a Sabbath, you won't see the kingdom and things like that. But then there are libertine, possibly Gnostic passages that collide with that. If you fast, you will do evil to your spirits. If you pray, you will be damned. Things like that that seem to have a radical, realized eschatology that sounds Gnostic. Then there's Encretite passages, I think anyway. I know not everybody interprets them that way, but when you make the two one so that the male is no longer female, nor the male is no longer male, nor the female female, that seems to me to have to do with ascetical celibacy gospel stuff. Some of those Encretites were also Gnostics, but you wouldn't have to be. And there seems to be Marcionite material, Jesus brushing away the notion that the prophets could have predicted him. So I think you have just all kinds of stuff collected in there, and that points in various different directions, including Gnostic. If you compare it with anything else in the Nag Hammadi documents, you don't have this the cosmic fall within the Godhead, the pleroma, the demiurge, and any of that stuff. A lot of it is compatible with Gnosticism, but it sure doesn't teach much of Gnosticism.
You mentioned Encretites. What are the other interpretations? Is that strictly metaphorical, that it has no relationship to any Christian groups like that?
Stephen Davies thinks that it has to do with the language and concepts of Philo of Alexandria, because he does use male and female in a somewhat different sense, saying that the male stands for the rational faculty and the female for the emotions and so forth, and so that the female must become male, as in saying 114. But you can also find something like that in the Buddhist scripture, the Lotus Sutra. That could mean a lot of things, but it seems to me that you have Stephen Davies says this, and it surprises me a bit, because in his terrific book, the Gospel of Thomas in Christian wisdom, his interpretations often seem to me to verge on the Encretite theory, despite the fact that he really thinks it's Philonic influence. But I think that's what he says. You've got to unify the emotions and the desires with reason, and kind of like a Platonic idea, bringing all of your faculties together under the reins of the mind. And that would make some sense, but to me, there's just too much stuff. Like, as Davy says, it points in a baptismal liturgical direction that also has to do with casting off your clothing to become naked, and casting off sexuality and so forth. That strikes me as more like the Encratites, who flourished for centuries in Asia Minor. And of course, it may not even be an either-or thing, because Philo has some association with the Therapeutae, who were an Essene-like sect in Egypt, and they apparently were Encratite Jews. So I'm not sure if it's an either-or thing, but that's the major alternative. Other people, I think, just say, who the heck knows what this means?
Yeah, I was thinking, because of a lot of these tendencies, does that help date the gospel at all? Does it make it a later work for all these various influences that come together in that gospel?
I kind of think so. I think that even the stuff that parallels the synoptic gospels but is shorter and simpler, some say, this is earlier, more primitive material. But I think it can be just as easily, if not better, explained by saying, no, this is memory quotations by someone who has heard these Gospels read in church, doesn't have a copy in front of him, and is reproducing what he can remember of it. We do the same thing when we try to memory quote something often. We haven't actually memorized it, and this guy probably wouldn't even have had the chance to. So to me, the synoptic style stuff in Thomas has re-entered the oral tradition by way of memory quotation, and that implies a liturgical use of the Gospels, which I think are second century anyhow. So I think Thomas is post at least the synoptics. And what you're saying is another argument for that.
I was reading David Trobish's brief article, I think it was in the Skeptical Inquirer, about Polycarp and his publishing of the New Testament, and he suggested somewhere like between 153 and 168, but before 180. And I'm thinking, at the same time I was reading the Annotated Scholars Version, the infamous Jesus Seminar translation, and the section that they had on Thomas in that, they were dating it to be that Thomas was writing at the same time, almost contemporaneously with the synoptics. So I was just wondering, because at first I was not convinced of your argument about that the Gospel of Thomas was produced by memory quotes and so forth, because I thought I saw a lot of polemical rewritings in it. But the more I read, like I read their version, I read some of their commentary, and I reread your commentary, and it's like I'm starting to think that you're right.
Yeah, I think it makes a bit more sense that way, though I hold the door open for the Cross and Kester Patterson view that you could easily take it to be more primitive. Just saying by saying doesn't really sound that way to me, but it's not an open and shut case. They could be right, and besides, I'm thinking that the other Gospels are second century anyway, and Thomas need not be all that much later. I suppose it would be a generation or so later, though.
Right, because if somebody's dating the synoptics to even go into circulation that late in the second century, then that really makes Thomas a lot later.
Yeah, well, then the Encratites, we know of them in the second century, but also in the third and fourth, I believe. Manichaeans were prominent Encratites, so that feature really could date them all over the timeline.
Oh, by the way, Dr. Price, somebody had use the some kind of app in Google Plus, and that deactivated your camera. So if you wanted to turn it on, it's up to you, but it would be one of the icons that's in the center of the screen there, the one with the camera. If you click on that, it'll bring your actual camera view back up.
Let's see.
That's it. Okay.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. I wonder what happened.
It was somebody had used an app for taking pictures of people on their camera, on their webcams. So
Are you sure they just couldn't stand the horrific visit they were seeing and the Medusa-like apparition?
It'll either have to be me or Reuven or Doug, because that's all we got in here.
Oh.
Yeah, I thought we'd have a full house and people would be falling on over each other trying to get in.
But once they realized, oh, you mean that Bible geek? Gee,
Yeah.
I got an appointment.
Yeah, I thought it was Mark Hart or whatever it was. The
Catholic
teen Bible geek.
Mm.
Well, I saw on the event page for Facebook that someone had written, "Who is Dr. Price and why did I get an invitation and why would I want to ask him a question?" And I looked up her name and she had been in the Bible Geek listeners for 11 months. Apparently didn't even know it. Didn't know who you were. Which I'm beginning to think that, a good portion of the 1,000 and plus people we have in that group maybe don't know who you are either. Sometimes I wonder.
Oh boy, that's great.
So how late did you want to stay on, assuming that all of a sudden people start flocking in?
Well, it doesn't really matter. I'm happy to stay around.
Because we could go, till 4 or 5 in the morning. If a lot of these hangouts that Reuven hosts goes, the recorded part goes for the full. I think there's a limit, 5 hours or something like that. But if you're not live, it can continue on indefinitely, I believe.
Oh, yeah, I don't mind going for a while.
Reuven, do you have any questions? He's probably eating cookies.
Yeah, I can't wait to hear his voice. I never have.
And you won't. He never
None
appears. Yeah, he never appears live.
Oh.
So one time he did a robotic voice, I think, for a short period of time, but no one. It was difficult to understand, I believe.
I see there. Let's see. Are there any messages here that are in the chat that are actually questions?
No, unfortunately.
Oh, okay.
The only people that type into chat are the people that you see at the bottom of your screen.
I see. Okay.
And people who are listening live from YouTube or from the Google Plus page can type in questions there, and it'll appear as a Q&A button here. And if you click it, then you'll see the questions that they asked, but we haven't received any. So.
Oh, okay.
Doug, did you have any other questions?
Well, I can come up with a few. Oh, there's someone. I'll let them go.
Welcome, David.
Hello, thank you.
Do you have a question for Dr. Price?
Yes, I actually listed it in the, or typed it in the comments earlier. It was about the origin of the Yahweh character, and if Dr. Price had any evidence for whether this Yahweh character originated with the Ugarit mythology.
I've read that the name Yahweh in one form or another does turn up. I'm not sure if it's in the Ugaritic texts or in the Ebla texts, but there's enough of it to indicate that Yahweh was either the name of several gods or was nearly generic like Elohim was, which would make some sense of the Shema, the fact that it doesn't just say Yahweh our God is one, but rather Yahweh our God is one Yahweh. If they're trying to say, look, there are not a whole lot of them, there's just one. And that's pretty interesting stuff if that's the case. And now we definitely have parallels in the Ugaritic texts to the general shape of the pantheon, because in Deuteronomy 32, I think it's pretty clear that Yahweh is one of the 70 sons of Elyon, the highest God, and that sort of makes him like Baal, who was one of the sons of El, the same name, the high god. And like Baal, Yahweh was a storm god and a warrior god. Why the different names, I don't know, but he seems to correspond in many ways, both to Marduk and Baal. And but I don't think the name Yahweh appears there. Might just be luck, because it does appear elsewhere now.
So what are the other places where it appears?
I got to recheck that. I sort of think it was in records from the Ebla Empire that they discovered only in the 1970s in Syria. Boy, I can try to look that up by the time of the next Bible Geek if my sieve-like memory can retain that.
Okay, thank you. And is the Yahweh character in the Old Testament the same as the Father character in the Trinity in the New Testament?
Oh, that's a real good one. Margaret Barker has really made me think about that. She says that there is good reason to believe. I mean, you can never prove any of this stuff, but there's real good reason to think that early Christians understood Jesus to be a theophany of Yahweh or Jehovah, and that they still remembered that he was the son of El Elyon or Elohim, and that's who the Father is. The Father is Elohim or El Elyon, and when Jesus is talking to him, it's the lesser God talking to the elder one. And one of the pieces of evidence for this is that she says that Jesus is called Son of God, Theos, which is, of course, equivalent, as you know, to Elohim, God generically, but he is never called the Son of the Lord, the Son of the Kurios, which would mean the son of Yahweh. And she says that's the most obvious natural answer to that, is that he was Yahweh, the Father wasn't. And that kind of throws a new light on the whole thing. So I kind of go along with that. I think she's probably right. Yahweh isn't the Trinity, he's the Son.
Interesting. Thank you very much.
That woman is a genius.
Welcome, Hector.
I'm sorry, what'd you say?
We had a new arrival, Hector.
Ah.
Oh, so a whole bunch of people just showed up at once. Hector, do you have a question for Dr. Price? Did you have anything else, David, that you wanted to add or ask?
No, that was covered very well, thank you.
Okay. I did have one question about Yahweh as a part of that one. He's not referred to as Yahweh or Yah in Ugaritic text. Is that correct? What is he referred to there? Is it Yahweh?
I'm not sure. I didn't remember that any version of it appeared there, but I could just be wrong. I'm not. I haven't read that stuff recently enough to know. I thought it was in other material, but perhaps it is in Ugaritic text.
Yeah, I thought I read that recently, but I thought maybe you had knew offhand.
No, I bet you're right. I bet you're right.
Okay. Just to remind everybody, if you don't have a question for Dr. Price that you don't want to get into live, you can type it in the chat. So since Hector, or Hector, was here before everyone else, he says, Dr. Price, what would you say to the claim by at least one Catholic writer that it is the Church gives authority to the Bible, not the other way around?
As a matter of history, it's certainly true, because the Church created and selected and authorized the Bible. and it's because the church says it's authoritative that people believe that it is. And even theologically, they are saying that, yeah, this is one of the channels of the teaching of the apostles, and therefore these texts have to be interpreted according to the tradition of the church. And so they're not biblicists in the Protestant sense, and in a sense never have been, because though they for the longest time did take it literally, of course they also believed there were other levels of meaning, and who could discern them but the church? And so you don't, the text means nothing without an authoritative interpretation, they said, and warned Protestants, you're going to have chaos if you don't have an authoritative interpreter like we do. And of course they were right, but that doesn't mean they do have an infallible interpreter. But there is a lot to that. There's a great little book by Willy Marxen, Marxsen, called The Bible as the Church's Book. And this guy was a radical Protestant, I think a Lutheran, and he said, oh yeah, we've really sawed, as Protestants, we've sawed off the limb we're sitting on, because the canon of Scripture is a product of church tradition, whereas we say tradition has to wait upon Scripture. Well, it's just not going to work. I don't think he tried to stick with any traditional Protestant hermeneutic as a result, but he admitted what most Protestants can't, but that Catholics kind of can. There was the Roman Catholic modernist Alfred Loisy, who took a radical critical stance on the Old and the New Testaments, and he figured his approach would be welcome, because he said, look, our epistemology is that we believe revelation comes through the church. That's what tells us what to believe. If the Bible doesn't happen to back that up, what of it? And of course they didn't. He was ahead of his time, and they kicked him out. But nowadays you have many Catholics saying exactly that. Even Raymond Brown, who was sort of conservative, he'd have been burned at the stake by the church in earlier centuries. He was a very searching critic, willing to say, yeah, this didn't happen, this is a contradiction, all that, because he could afford to. He let the church govern his beliefs, and he didn't have to find them in the Bible.
Did that answer your question, Hector Vincenzo? Oh, cool. He's very pleased. Alrighty. So once you're done with the question, if you would mind leaving the Hangout, and you can listen live at those links that I had displayed. We will move on then. The next questioner will be Gary. But he needs to be unmuted.
All right.
There you go.
First off, I wanted to thank Dr. Price for this wonderful live Bible Geek event. It's great to be on a hangout with you all.
You too.
And to get to see you, you need to make it out to Arizona at some point in time.
Yeah, I have a favorite bagel place out there.
Oh, well, there you go. What more reason do you need? I posted on the... I don't know if you could see it. There was a picture I posted several Christmases ago that I ended up kind of getting raked over the coals about. I don't know that you can see it. It's on the actual regular Google page, but I can read the in the Hangout. I'll just read the context of it. Born of a virgin on December 25th, known to his 12 disciples as the Son of God, and resurrected 3 days after his death, we wish happy birthday to Mithras, and the mythical Persian god imagined over 600 years before the other guy. Now, this was evidently something that was put up in Times Square or somewhere populated. And my question is, so I ended up getting raked over the coals because it's supposed to be factually inaccurate, along with complaints that I received that it was, various things, dings on Acharya S, supposedly being the source of it, which may or may not be true, even for all I know. My question is it in fact wrong? And if it is in fact wrong, in what ways?
Yeah, I think it is misinformation. There are close parallels with other dying and rising gods that were pre-Christian, but I don't believe we have any information about Mithras having disciples or coming back to life after the third day. The closest thing you do have to that is that he was a sun god, and on the shortest day of the year, they understood that to be his death, and then the next day getting longer. What is it? After the equinox or whatever, I can never keep that straight. That they celebrated his rebirth, because the sun is going to be longer and longer in the sky, so the sun is growing up. So in a sense, they thought of him as a dying and rising god, death and rebirth. But I don't believe there was a story attached to it. I could be wrong, but I've never heard to it lacked, because Mithras, his big deal that you would get initiated into was his slaying of the cosmic bull. And some have speculated that that is Mithras himself in another form, so that that's a dying and rising god myth, but I'm not sure if that's the case. The business about his being born on the 25th, yeah, that's well-founded, but the problem is that there's no early claim, certainly not in the Bible, that Jesus was born on the 25th. That's a later inference that they, even in the late 2nd century, had different guesses as to when Jesus was born. Mithras, in his religion, there was a sacred meal, and that is sort of like the idea of Holy Communion. And there was apparently some sort of a baptism in blood, the blood of the bull, the tarabolium, a hunter's ritual that was used in connection with mystery religions. But some have challenged that and said that, oh no, there's not adequate evidence for that. I don't know I don't know the state of that. One thing I would recommend as a resource would be in the book Bart Ehrman and the Quest of the Historical Jesus of Nazareth. I believe Frank Zindler has an essay in there about Mithraic parallels that goes into much greater detail than anything I ever heard otherwise. But the notion that you also sometimes hear that Mithras was crucified, that's I don't think there's any evidence of that in any ancient source that they believe that.
Yeah, I didn't believe so. You get into so many false parallels between Religulous, the Bill Maher movie, where they pull in a bunch of Horus also is like Jesus, and all these. I mean, there definitely are those parallels to some degree, but they're so overstated that they really stretch credibility and I feel ignorant for citing them and then finding out, well, it's all a load of BS. So you also have the Zeitgeist movies and that sort of thing, and a lot of that just doesn't add up. And rather than make assertions that are untrue, it's interesting to know these things.
Yeah, because this kind of thing is true, but when people use bad examples, it tempts people to just lump it all together also and to dismiss it. And that's why I stick to certain parallels where I know the text, and like there's a lot of parallels between Jesus and Osiris. I mean, a lot of them, and they're pre-Christian, and it does involve Horus, but really he's just an adjunct to the larger Osiris myth, and that is highly relevant. I'd rather stick to that and Attis and even Hercules and some other ones that are dying. Directed toward Charya because I did a pretty scathing review of her first book years ago, but since then she's really taken heed and taken part a number of the criticisms I made, and she just does totally different, superior work now that people don't seem to give the time of day to. So I kind of wish people would read her latter day works, which are really fascinating.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Dr. Price. I'll let someone else have the turn now.
Thank you, Dave. Good questions. As we move on, I just wanted to let everybody know that this is where you can listen live. If you don't have a question for Dr. Price, we appreciate it if you just listen live at one of these two links. The next person that came in was Pedro. Pedro, did you have a question for Dr. Price? Pedro asks, what is the evidence for the existence of Simon Magus?
Basically, I think that it's Josephus. Josephus talks about a Simon who was a kind of Rasputin character, I think he implies anyway, who was associated with the circle of Felix, Festus, Bernice, Drusilla, and so forth, who were mentioned in Acts, as is Simon Magus. And we're told that he helped convince one of these women, I forget which, they were sisters, to get her fiance, I guess, or lover, or whatever, to be circumcised, so she, as even a Hellenized Jew, could marry him, and he did, but then she dumped him and married some pagan. And so there's a little bit here and there about a Simon who was a magician, and he's associated with the same people with whom Paul is associated in the book of Acts, and coupling that with F.C. Bauer's reading of the Simon Magus story in Acts, it convinces me that Simon Magus is very likely the basis for Paul. And Bauer's theory was that the story where Simon approaches Simon Peter, having seen him dispense the Holy Spirit to converts by the laying on of hands, approaches him and says, well, I'm a Christian too now. Could you teach me that trick? I'd like to be able to convey the Spirit, and the whole point of Acts is that only apostles can do this. It's part of Luke's agenda that everything has to be authenticated by the Jerusalem apostles. And so then Peter says, literally, to hell with you and your money. May this plan of yours be forgiven you, because otherwise I see you languishing in the chains of bitterness and so on. And then he says, oh, no, pray for me that this may not befall me. And Bauer said, I think I see behind this another version of Galatians where it says that Paul went to the Jerusalem apostles, including Cephas or Peter, to get their recognition of his mission, and they agreed to do it on the condition that he would collect money for their church, and he agreed to do it. But eventually, when he brought the money there, it was rejected. Romans anticipates that it will, and in another story in Acts, I think 21, he uses this money to pay for the post-Nazarite ritual cleansing of some Jews, Christian or not, it doesn't say, but he gets into trouble because a riot begins at the temple, and that kind of implies it was rejected. So Bauer says that it looks like this is a kind of a polemical, invidious caricature of Paul. Now, why not call him Paul? Well, because by Luke's day, Jewish Christians had accepted Paul, and he didn't want to lose the story. So why not just split him into two characters, and Simon Magus becomes the anti-Simon Peter, and so forth. And I find that pretty convincing, especially since in the Pseudo-Clementine novels, based on second-century sources, there is this astonishing debate between Simon Peter and Simon Magus, and it is absolutely clear Simon Magus is the mouthpiece for Marcionite Pauline doctrine. And Bauer plugged all this in and says, look, Simon Magus is the Jewish polemical version of Paul. And since Josephus also knows of a wizard Simon, and he's associated with the people with whom Paul is associated, and there's more to it than this, but that's why I think Simon Magus was Paul, and that there was a Simon Magus. You wouldn't, like all the stuff Bauer points to, wouldn't establish that there was a historical Simon Magus. By itself, that would just mean that Paul has been doubled as Simon, but the fact that there is a Simon the sorcerer in Josephus makes me think, yeah, this is the same guy. So.
Thank you, Pedro, for your question. I'd like to move on to Jim.
Hello, Dr. Price. Can you hear me all right?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Very good. My question concerns the various wordings of the words of institution. I was comparing the versions from the Gospels and Corinthians, and I noticed that the little tidbit about doing this in remembrance of me, it's in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 11, and it matches only that in Luke. And I also just came upon a little tidbit on the internet that that's actually omitted from the Codex Bezae version of Luke. So I hadn't come across this idea before, but I wonder if you have any theories about the chain of custody of this little bit of verbiage, and just how you put that puzzle together.
Yeah, this is fascinating. Both Albert Schweitzer and Joachim Jeremias study this, and Jeremias must have known about Schweitzer's work, but it seems they independently follow the same chain of logic to the same conclusion, which is that Mark's version appears to be the earliest, and that the others have been, I mean, even if 1 Corinthians is an earlier document, which I wouldn't grant, but even if it is, that doesn't mean that its version is the earliest, because it may already have begun to be embellished. Mark may somehow have preserved an earlier version, so the relative dates of the documents don't automatically rank the relative dates of the traditions. So they both said that everything that is not in Mark can easily be explained as a subtraction or an embellishment. And one particularly good example would be the "do this in remembrance of me," because think of how in 1 Corinthians it says, thus you remember the Lord till he comes. Well, you wonder if that somewhere along the line has not been put into Jesus' own mouth. And you have to wonder about the textual integrity of the manuscripts we have, because we know there's been funny business. We have manuscripts of Matthew and Mark, some of which say, "This is my blood of the covenant," but others say, "My blood of the new covenant." And just like in the Catholic liturgy, of the new and eternal covenant. That doesn't appear in any manuscripts, but it illustrates the kind of process of embellishment. in Luke, you've got the difference over whether there are two cups, one before the bread and one after. And Jeremias argued there that the longer version is the original Lucan version, but I think that's I don't agree with that. But it seems to me that of our New Testament versions, the earliest one probably is Mark. But I think Schweitzer said even all of this is not original. He believed that this does go back to Jesus, the apocalyptic preacher, and that what Jesus said at the supper was simply the vow of abstinence. I will not drink of this fruit of the vine with you until we drink it new in the kingdom of God. That the kingdom was to come so soon, he could kind of go on a hunger strike until it did. And so Schweitzer said the bread and cup thing, this is my flesh and so on, that has to be a sacramental accretion later. And you also kind of have to think that when you look at the Didache, which seems to be late 1st, early 2nd century, some sort of a Syrian church manual, where it specifically calls it the Eucharist and gives the formula for dedicating it, and there's none of this body and blood stuff. It says that we, partaking of one loaf, are one body, as the wheat is gathered from all over the field, so gather your church together. And the wine, it says something about the holy vine of your servant David, and it sounds nothing like any of the New Testament versions, and it's a little hard to imagine somebody saying, "Well, this is in the Gospels, but the hell with it. What was that idea you had over there, Bill?" So it looks like the whole thing has continually evolved, but probably Mark sticks to the closest to the earliest reading in that tradition. What a mess. Those are really interesting books. Schweitzer's is The Mystery of the Lord's Supper, and Jeremias's is The Eucharistic Words of Jesus.
Very good, thanks.
That was a great question. I didn't even realize I was wondering that myself until he asked that question.
I'm sorry, you didn't realize what, John?
I didn't realize that I was wondering that same question myself until he asked it. Okay, we have another question from the chat from John Burnham. Let's see, it kind of scrolled up a bit, so I got to go back up a little. Okay. John asks, what evidence have you found, if any, that Jesus was associated with the Essene community at Qumran?
The evidence there is pretty oblique. There's a lot of similarities between the sect of the Qumran scrolls, Essenes, or whoever they were, and John the Baptist. There are a lot of similarities there. They both ate roasted locusts. They baptized daily. I think that's what it implies with John the Baptist in the Gospels even. They were apocalyptic doomsayers and believed in a coming baptism of fire and spirit and so forth. They lived out in the desert, and both are associated with that proof text from the 2nd Isaiah, "Behold, a voice crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord," and all that. And they're both in the Judean desert, and so people for a long time have said, gee, I wonder if John the Baptist had been part of that community for a while and then struck out on his own. Not unreasonable, but hard to prove, because you probably had very similar ascetic practices all over the place there. Now, the thing with Jesus is that Jesus is pointedly different from John the Baptist in the Gospels. People are saying, gee, now, why is it
you're kind of breaking up your video and your audio.
Do you want me to try to dump the video and see if that'll help the audio?
Yeah, you want to go ahead and try that for a while, just to make sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, since the New Testament, the Gospels oppose John to Jesus in some of these ways, like in Luke, the disciples approach him and say, "Teach us to pray as John the Baptist taught his disciples." Well, that implies that they don't use whatever prayer John prescribed, and they want their own instead. And we have the contrast. John the Baptist came neither eating nor drinking, and you say he's demon-possessed, but the Son of Man came eating and drinking. You say, look at this glutton, this boozer. What is this? It kind of looks like they were very different in their approach. And so why is that? Is it that they just were never similar, but people compared and contrasted them because they were both well known? Or is it that Jesus was a disciple of John? And of course, the big hint there is that he's baptized by John. And then he broke with him. He thought that the kingdom was even closer, or the fact that it was close meant that it was a time of fulfillment, not preparation, so you didn't have to do all the fasting and praying. You could rejoice. That makes some sense. It's hard to say because there's such a meager handful of little hints, and it gets worse because the Luke and the Mark passages teach us to pray as John taught his disciples, and John's disciples fast, why don't yours? Well, as Bultmann said, these really don't tell us anything about the practice of Jesus himself. Otherwise, the narrative would have these guys saying to Jesus, why don't you fast? Why don't you pray as John did? The fact that it's in both cases, what do the disciples of Jesus do vis-a-vis John's? Bultmann said that looks more like Christians are trying to invoke Jesus in a fictive manner to adjudicate debates about what they as Christians did. And so who knows what Jesus would have done. And the same thing, people often invoke parallels between the early church and the book of Acts and the Dead Sea Scrolls. There was a council of 12 with an inner circle of 3. There was a communal treasury and so forth. That looks an awful lot like the manual of discipline of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But again, that's not Jesus necessarily. So it's really hard to say. Barbara Thiering thinks that Jesus was an Essene and was kicked out, and that he's the one referred to in the scrolls as the wicked priest. And that makes sense, but it's just hard to be sure. So there is evidence, depending on how you construe it. I just don't think there's any way to be sure about it.
As a follow-up question to John's, unfortunately, he either dropped out or left. I'm not sure exactly. I read in a book, I think it was called Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is probably from the 1980s. Based on what is said in the Gospels and what we know from the sectarian manuscripts from Qumran, except for just a few things like the mentions of the sons of light, I believe that's in the Gospel of Luke, there was very little overlap between what Jesus taught in the Gospels and what they found in the sectarian manuscripts.
Look at that kitty.
He's a new addition.
When I would speak from the lectern in our house, when we had a house church, the Holy Grail, our cat Helix, who looked a lot like this kitty, would often jump up on the lectern and crawl over my shoulder and then talk about a distraction, but I didn't mind it. Anyway, yeah, Raymond Brown and Edwin Yamauchi and others liked to show that there were more parallels between the Gospel of John and the Dead Sea Scrolls, because there you have like the spirit of truth and the light versus darkness duality and so forth, and then even the John the Baptist business there with the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. You can find parallels to at least the Book of Enoch, though that wasn't one of their own, like you say, sectarian originals. But and they love to say this because they say, aha, you see, this is authentic Palestinian Judaism. It's not some wacky Gnosticism, and so we don't have to say the Gospel of John shows the influence of Gnosticism. Of course, that was really oversimplified and premature because the Mandean texts, though we don't have real early copies, of course, we don't have much earlier ones for the New Testament either, but the Mandean texts have a lot of startlingly close parallels to the Gospel of John, and that is Palestinian Jewish Gnosticism. Bultmann already said, look, the Dead Sea Scrolls are Gnosticized Judaism. And so I never bought that attempt to ground the Gospel of John as authentic Palestinian Judaism and therefore authentic Jesus and not alien influences. I mean, it's not even a dichotomy, but again, the problem of dissimilarity. The more you can show that this lingo appears in various types of Orthodox and sectarian Judaism, the less sure you can be that it wasn't borrowed from there and attributed to Jesus in a secondary way. So it's plausible that to say, oh, these guys sound just like Jesus, but it's just too equivocal.
Thank you for that answer, Dr. Price. Let's move on to Buck. Did you want to go live, Buck? You're muted.
All right, hold on.
There you go.
Put on your prognosticator hat. A few years ago, I asked you about the LDS Church being on the top of the heap in the future. I saw statistics where there's 7,000 churches
a little bit
closing. I'm getting some feedback on this end.
Yeah, some odd thing is.
But just what do you think is going to happen in the future? We've got 7,000 churches leaving, 1,500 clergy per year leaving. The X and the Y generation aren't coming to church. What do you think the new myth is going to be?
Do you mean that this attrition is happening in the LDS church?
No, it seems the LDS is the only one that's growing. It seems all the mainliners are just bailing like crazy.
Yeah. They're really surprising studies by evangelical pastors and reporters and so on that indicate that not only are there drastically lower numbers of them in the United States than we've been told for years, but that they're rapidly shrinking, just like you say, and that eventually they'll be selling these mega churches to somebody else. The giving is drying up. The institutions won't be able to support themselves. A lot of the youth is leaving and doesn't seem to be coming back. The internet has made skeptical literature much more accessible, and Josh McDowell and the others think that it is really dealing them a deadly blow. So I wouldn't be surprised. And, of course, the Roman Catholic Church is really hemorrhaging, too, but it isn't as noticeable since they have a huge influx of Hispanic immigrants coming in who are Catholics and a lot of Africans as well. So they may hold on for a longer period. But I have a hunch that the Mormon movement will stay viable and vigorous a lot longer than that, partly because of the social system they have in place, this mutual aid structure and so on. I think that they're a younger, more vital movement, and they may very well be the main alternative to Catholicism in later in this century or the next, then you wonder then how they're going to stack up against Islam. So I have a hunch the Mormons are already a separate world religion in their own right. And they're going to keep going, I'm sure. And, of course, they're really nice, wholesome people with admirable virtues and behavior. It's sort of a shame they're believing in historically baseless stuff, but of which religion is that not true?
Right, that's the point, yeah. Thank you, Doctor.
Buck, if you have more questions, you can continue if you want, or if you had any more comments, feel free.
Let's let someone else take a stab.
Okay, well, we had Joseph in here, but he left. So that leaves Hector up next, who wrote, Dr. Price, living in Mexico, a Roman Catholic country, I encountered Roman Catholic theology more often in my everyday experiences than Protestant theology. Although Protestantism is certainly growing at the expense of Roman Catholicism in Mexico as we speak, what authors would you minimally recommend reading to get a passable grounding in Roman Catholic theology, both conservative and liberal?
With the liberals, of course, the most impressive one I have read is Hans Kung, and I enjoyed his book, The Church, and also even more on being a Christian. These are decades old now, but they're real good. And let's see, there are other ones more recent that I'm not as familiar with. I like a book by, I think he's a Catholic charismatic writer, Alan Schreck. I believe that's right, probably Schreck. And what's it called? Is it What Catholics Believe? I could be wrong about that, but I'm sure that's his name. And I believe a book of his is published by Servant, the Ann Arbor Catholic Charismatic Press, but it'd be easy enough to track him down on Amazon. I think that is a really helpful, plain-spoken defense of Catholic belief against Protestant distortions of it. It's a very clarifying book. And with traditional Catholicism, I have to admit I haven't read him, but from what I gather, Fulton Sheen is probably a real good communicator who knew his stuff. Aquinas himself can get to be deep waters, but any topic you're interested in with him is well worth reading. This guy was an incredible genius, like his arguments for the existence of God and so on. I believe, oh man, I'm blanking out on this man's name. Boy. Oh, I've almost got it, but boy, I cannot think of his name. He's an older writer, but very clear. I'm almost thinking his last name is Sheed, but that's probably the I'm thinking of Sheed and Ward that published him. Oh boy, I think there's a Francis Maloney who also is a good traditionalist Catholic writer. One of the most penetrating critiques of modern Catholic, like post-Vatican II theology, is James Hitchcock, The Rise and Fall of Radical Catholicism, which is really a terrific book. The guy is really against it, but his arguments are not just some sort of slurs. I'd heartily recommend that one. G.K. Chesterton. I don't know how specifically he gets into Catholic distinctives, but he's a writer they're pretty proud of, and I guess Hilary Belloc also is. I'm sure Catholic would have better suggestions, but that's all I can come up with now. Boy, something is eluding me, but I can't quite think what it is.
Yeah, for that we refer you to to the other Bible geek, the Catholic Bible geek.
Mm.
Well, I jumped the gun on Hector's question. I should have went next to question from Derek. His question is, the serpent tells Eve that they will not die in that day, and they do survive. I've heard apologists say that died spiritually in that day. And the cat just walked in front of me, and I can't see what I'm reading. Okay, back up to there. Thanks, cat. Okay. I've heard apologists say that died spiritually in that day. Does it say anywhere in the Bible that they died spiritually, and how does that apply to the Genesis story?
It seems to me that is just a rationalizing evasion tactic. I don't see any kind of... I mean, this sounds to me like in Star Wars, where Obi-Wan says, a young Jedi named Darth Vader betrayed and murdered your father. And then Luke finds out, I am your father. And he confronts Obi-Wan, I guess Obi-Wan's ghost, about this. And you told me that Vader killed him. And he says, well, in a manner of speaking, he did. Come on. It's just so contrived. And I find the same thing there. Is there any hint that something like that is at stake in that story any place? Whereas the real elephant in the room there is that it's pretty clear that God or Yahweh is lying and the serpent is telling the truth. And you can tell this because Eve says that if we can eat of any of the fruit of the trees of the garden except the tree of knowledge of good and evil, because if we eat that, we'll die. And the serpent says, you won't die. I tell you what will happen, though. Your eyes will be open, and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. Well, now what happens? She eats, and the narrator, who we kind of have to trust on this, says their eyes were opened. And also he says, when she saw that the fruit was good for food and desirable to make one wise, she took some of it and ate and gave some to her husband with her, and he ate. Okay, they don't die. The narrator says that their eyes are open, just like he had the serpent say. And then when Yahweh sees what's happened, he says to his fellow deities, they've become like one of us, knowing good and evil. So I'd say if you have the narrator, whose story it is, saying that what the serpent said would happen did happen, and if you have the narrator depicting God admitting that what the serpent said would happen has happened, then you have to realize this is kind of like the Prometheus myth, that this God is not the friend of humanity. The serpent is like Prometheus, and Yahweh is like Zeus. He wants to keep his divine prerogatives to himself, and he punishes the serpent for sharing them with the humans, just as Zeus punished Prometheus. You don't even need to bring in questions. Well, could they have died in some other way? No, because it's saying that she now understands the fruit was good for food. In other words, she had thought it was not good for food, poison, because she was told that the day you bite into it, you'll drop dead. So it must be poison. Now she knows, oh no, it's good for food. So the opposition surely means that she thinks it's poison, and that was a lie. So God doesn't he could kill him on the spot, but instead he can't do that because of where the story is headed. It's the story of the first humans, right? If God snuffs them out right there, no readers. So they have to remain alive long enough to procreate. So he doesn't kill them on the spot, but he does deprive them of the chance of eternal life. And so they in J, you don't really know how long they're supposed to have lived, but you have these long lifespans in P's genealogy. And there it says he lived like over 900 years. But there's no hint that they meant dying in some spiritual sense. That's as alien to the context as the idea that when it says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, you will bruise his head and he will bruise your heel. You'll bruise his heel. That to say that, well, that's really about the Virgin Mary and Satan. What? Or even saying that Satan is a character in this story. There's no hint of that. And back then they didn't even believe Satan was an evil being. So this is just an attempt to read later theology back into it and to get God off the hook. Whereas in the straight reading of the story, as the Gnostics understood, he's just a liar. I mean, this remains invisible to conventional Christians for obvious reasons, but that doesn't mean the text doesn't clearly say it.
Great question. I got another one from Dean Martin, the little old winemaker. Since Old Testament minimalism studies have had such dramatic impact over the last 100 years on the accepted consensus of what was previously generally accepted as historical fact of Old Testament characters, and given the fact that there is little to no extra biblical evidence for a historical Jesus, the 12 disciples, an early first century Nazareth, etc., can there be a convincing case made for a new school of biblical study, maybe called New Testament minimalism?
You took the words right out of my mouth. I've said that in print a couple of times. I agree with you. Great minds think alike. And in fact, Frank Zindler, if I understand him correctly, who's a mythicist and an old buddy of Philip Davies, one of the prominent Old Testament minimalists, Davies has come around to believing in Christ mythicism. And it's because, as I read one of Davies' books, I kept thinking, boy, this applies so well to the New Testament. I wonder when he's going to get around to it. And apparently he is. And that's what I hope will happen. In fact, I'd almost rather dump the jargon of the Christ myth theory and just talk about New Testament minimalism. And because it is, as you say, exactly the same approach with the same sort of scrutiny of the same sort of evidence. And I think eventually, well, you are seeing gradually more and more of it, like Thomas L. Brody came out and said, yeah, all right, Jesus didn't exist. And if I've got Davies right, there's another one, and who knows? I think the pendulum may swing a bit more, though I doubt if I'll live to see it. I don't know that it will ever dominate the field, but anything's possible. Something's gotta, and it's always changing. So I think we are witnessing the birth of New Testament minimalism exactly because of the factors you mentioned.
Thank you, Dr. Price. Thank you, Dean. Our old friend of the show, Rabbob, Robert Kraut,
Hey!
asks, Bob, how are you doing with Torrey's theory of the Aramaic origin of the Gospels and the first half of Acts, or of Acta?
I am still very intrigued by it. I worked out a kind of a theory explaining how this would fit very well into other theories that I favor, like the Polycarp being the redactor of the New Testament canon, and the one who padded out the Lucas into canonical Luke, and the author of Acts. Since I read Torrey on the book of Acts, and read his theory, well, not theory, he says the first 15 chapters of Acts appear to be translation Greek. And so he speaks of a first Acts that was an Aramaic document, and that somebody translated it into Greek and then continued it for 13 more chapters. Boy, does that fit the Polycarp view, because it means he treated Acts in much the same way he did Luke. And it also really fits F.C. Bauer's reconstruction, whereby you have the parallels that between Peter and Paul in Acts, the Catholicizing ecumenical approach, because the parallels are mainly confined to the all-Greek so-called second Acts, chapters 16 through 28. Usually there are one or two in the first Acts section that are made to be Petrine parallels, but in those cases they're not the only ones that match the Pauline stories. And so this would just fit both the Polycarp thing and the Peter-Paul parallel business of Bauer to a T. And so I find myself more and more convinced of it. And as with the idea that the Gospels in general were written in Aramaic, I'm still thinking about that, and I think the thing hinges on whether you can find instances of a hypothetical underlying Aramaic original that looks like it's been mistranslated into Greek in the narrative portions of the Gospels. Because if you restrict yourself to sayings, then that wouldn't prove. I mean, even if you can show that there are sayings that would make more sense if a hypothetical Aramaic original had been translated differently, that wouldn't prove any more than that, like what Joachim Jeremias says, that the sayings of Jesus were transmitted in Aramaic and then translated by the evangelists. But if you can show the narrative framework has what look like mistranslations, then you're talking about the whole narrative existing in Aramaic at one time. And I got to go back. I did make a chart of this. I've got to go back and study it again. But one example of that would be where in Mark, the anointing at Bethany is said to have happened in the house of Simon the leper. Now, that's really strange. There's no hint that this is a guy that Jesus healed. I mean, I suppose it could be. Maybe it's the same guy he heals of leprosy earlier on, but he's not named there, and there's no flashback. And is he still a leper? In case, what the heck are they doing at his house? And so Torrey shows that the same Aramaic word that would have been translated as leper is a homonym for jar merchant. And what happens at this guy's house? The woman, probably Mary Magdalene, breaks open a jar of expensive ointment and anoints Jesus. Well, to me, that might be the other shoe falling. That would make more sense if there was an Aramaic narrative, not just a saying of Jesus. So depending on how much more of that there is, I think that we ought to revive the case for an original Aramaic gospel. Of course, Torrey wasn't the only one to say so. Matthew Black also made a good case for that. And some of the arguments that the late, great Morris Casey aimed against Torrey, I find implausible. And so I'd go into that too. So I still got a lot of work to do on that, but I find the whole notion very attractive. This C.C. Torrey is unjustly neglected.
Okay, well, Reuben says we have no other questions from elsewhere. Does anybody currently in the Hangout have any further questions?
By the way, I'll try to get to an actual Bible Geek tomorrow. I've been spending a lot of time on this book, Holy Fable, and I'm far into Genesis now, and I'm going to try to finish up the Joseph thing tomorrow, and then do a Bible Geek. I hate to neglect it like I have.
Could you go into a little bit of detail about that book? I know you mentioned it in one of the recent podcasts, but I can't remember for some reason exactly what take you're going for in that book.
I am for the Pentateuch. I'm pointing out the source critical business. Is this a J story? Is it an E story? What difference does it make? Can you see their signature marks there? And then I am spending even more time on the types of legend that Gunkel pointed out, showing how virtually everything can be chalked up to a name origin explanation, or a fictive explanation for the origin of a ritual or a holy place or a rock formation, and things like this. That it's just incredible how one after the other falls neatly into these categories. Then I tried to show how a number of the stories have different sedimentary layers, and you can see an earliest version where, like, Abraham is the moon and Isaac is the sun and so forth, and then they get historicized, and the story is made to be about switching over from sacrificing infants to sacrificing animals, and then I'll show the similarity between that and a Hercules story. And so I take that approach. How Noah and his sons, that's really another telling of Cronus and his brothers castrating Uranus to dethrone him, and stuff like that. Then I'll probably do the same sort of thing with Joshua and Judges, concentrating on what are these stories trying to prove and why we think they're not historical. Once I get into Samuel and Kings and all that, I'm going to take a more flying approach and not get bogged down in every story there. With the prophets and shorter books like Jonah, Ruth, and Esther, there's less to say. I don't intend to go over like every oracle in Hosea and try to explain what it's about. So I'm giving short shrift to some things. And then when I get into the New Testament, I want to make general observations over kind of a running, shallow commentary on Mark and John, and then I am given the full text of Matthew and Luke to illustrate the source and redaction criticism based on Mark and so forth. With Paul, I think I'm going to take a different approach than I have in like The Amazing Colossal Apostle, where I tried to show how none of this goes back to Paul. I want to refer the reader to that, but I want to say let's take a close look at the epistles on the standard story, that if Paul did write this, what would it be about in that case? And just to be a bit different. And then the book of Revelation, I'm going to have a lot of fun with explaining what we think we know about what all the code refers to.
Reuven managed to write up a question. It says, Dr. Price, my question concerns Josephus' take on the location of the Garden of Eden. In the Antiquities, Josephus tells us that the 4 rivers of Eden were the Nile, Tigris, Euphrates, and the Ganges. This is substantially larger than both traditional Jewish and Christian understandings of Eden's size. What do you make of this? Is this another rationalistic fiction of Josephus, or is he tapping into a legitimately ancient belief in regards to Eden? Just wrote that just now.
I don't think there's any way to know, because the text in Genesis, from what I have read, has a huge problem. These rivers don't have a common source, though the writer thought they did, and 2 of the rivers, I'm probably mispronouncing this, the Gihon and the Pishon, or whatever it is, Pishon, I don't know, that these seem, there are rivers of these names, one of them in Jerusalem, that couldn't possibly be what the writer had in mind, or if he did, he's confused. So subsequent readers, even in the ancient world, must have tried to figure out what was really going on there. And I'm guessing that, given the implicitly universal scope of, here's the origin of the human race, it's the center of everything, that Josephus may just have been speculating on that. But he may have inherited it from someone else who knew more about geography than the J. Ryder did, and hypothesized it. So it could be both speculation and an already old tradition, but I couldn't guess which. That's really fascinating, though.
I don't know if it was a video I saw or something I read where the theory was that the ancients thought all these rivers were connected, possibly underground, into like a world network of rivers or something like that, or maybe through influence of Hellenism that ultimately all waters are connected through the surrounding ocean. Supposedly that encircled the world. So that was just something that I had that might have been behind something like that.
Fascinating. Wow. See, you and Reuven ought to be the Bible geeks. I'm telling you, you often bail me out, and I don't mean BAAL.
Yeah, Reuven and I are working together for a long time in various aspects of Bible geekery, and we help each other out whenever we can. Like putting on this hangout, which I really appreciate Reuven's taking the time out to making it happen. Actually,
yeah,
I do appreciate his help. He's immensely helpful, I think, and should always be considered a true Bible geek because he really helps a lot of times unseen. So I think he deserves a lot of appreciation.
My turban's off to him.
Well, we've been going on for about an hour and a half, so I thought it might be a good idea to go ahead and call it a quits for tonight because we don't have any more additional questions. I don't think anybody else does.
Well, I could ask. Hey, want to get underneath the wire?
Go ahead.
Yeah, let me ask one. Yeah. I'll type. Let me call. Is my mic on?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
What you think? Do you think that the Pliny the Younger letters to the Trajan Emperor, are forgeries, whole or in part?
I've only heard suspicion cast on, I guess the only one that really matters for our purpose, the business about interrogating Christians and so forth. That strikes me as being a Christian forgery in the same spirit as when Tertullian says that the Senate voted not to persecute Christians, and that there must be records of the trial of Jesus that I think Tertullian and Justin Martyr both falsely assert. And there are, I think that this is an apologetic creation to try to show, you see, even the Romans who persecute us admit they're not justified in it. So any Romans reading this, take a lesson. Because the writer has this Gestapo-like interrogator saying, well, I'm eager to persecute them, though I must admit they're all Boy Scouts and never do anything wrong and even take a vow never to do anything wrong, and they're really good guys, but of course I want to put them to death. Is that the policy? It just seems implausible, especially when he goes on to say, we're having a real economic crisis around here because so darn many people are converting to Christianity. The meat markets aren't selling the sacrificial meat, and they're going broke. I'm sorry, that to me just sounds ridiculous. It's like in Acts, 19 in Ephesus, where this guy, Demetrius, the silversmith, calls the union together and said, this guy's converting so many people that soon everybody's going to forget about the goddess whose souvenirs keep us in good money. Let's do something about it. Is it really possible, given the way the New Testament itself describes the reaction to Christianity, that it had come to that? It just seems fantasy. And so I think it is an apologetic creation. It's just like in, Titus? One of their own poets has said, And don't listen to me, or like Tertullian says, even the pagans say, "Behold how they love one another." Did they? They might have, but I have a hunch you'd like making up hostile testimony that turns out to be good testimony despite itself. So I think that one is a forgery. I'm not the only or the first one to think so. I didn't realize. I mean, these were my suspicions in ignorance, and then long afterward, I found out that one of the Tübingen scholars made the same argument, so I feel pretty good about that. There is another relevant one that I think is by Pliny that is relevant to forgery, though, because as Van Manen pointed out, one of these letters in which Pliny intercedes on behalf of a runaway slave looks so much like Philemon that, I mean, eerily like it, that you really have to suspect that somebody based Philemon on this thing. After all, Pliny's letters were published. It's not like you had to have a Watergate break-in to find it or something. So there are two that are relevant. One, I think, is a Christian forgery. One occasioned a Christian forgery.
Thank you, Dr. Price.
Thank you for the question.
And maybe one day you convince Ehrman, right?
Maybe. Recently he said that for the first time he began to doubt I think the burial story, that Jesus was buried in a rock tomb at all. It suddenly hit him like, why should we think this? So who knows? I mean, he's a smart guy, and he continues to think, and who knows where he'll end up.
I don't think that some people have been saying that Ehrman, probably accepts more of the radical notions than he lets on, but somebody had seen him recently in a lecture and brought up one of those points, and he was very indignant that he was even asked that question. So either he's keeping it very close to his chest, or he just is in an ongoing and a long process of changing.
What was it they asked him that he got hot under the collar about?
Boy, I can't recall now.
Was it a specific issue, or was it the idea that he might be more radical than he was letting on in general?
I think they asked him about a specific issue.
Okay, yeah.
I couldn't tell you what it might have been.
Interesting. Yeah, he certainly has done some great work, and I just hope he will. He's got the kind of mind where he can certainly strike out in an original direction, like he did in both the forgery book and the Orthodox corruption of Scripture. He should certainly feel free to break with the pack and go out on his own direction, and I hope he will eventually. He's doing great work anyway, though, no question about that.
I was just reading Bart Ehrman and the Quest of the Historical Jesus, the collection of essays that put out, and what struck me as odd is that there was something that Ehrman wrote at the beginning of Did Jesus Exist? And it basically said, it mentioned how Jesus became God, and that just so happens is the title of his latest book. So I'm thinking, Did Jesus Exist really just a rough draft of the book that he has out now? That's what I was thinking.
Interesting. I haven't read that one yet. I'm putting together a pile of his books that are new to me because I'm hoping eventually to I have a proposal, I think at Prometheus, doing this book I've long contemplated called Bart Ehrman Interpreted, which I mentioned to him, and the idea is to defend him against criticisms that he receives from conservatives, and then to, in an ironic way, to point out where he and I differ without attacking him. And he said it sounded good to him. So I'm looking forward to engaging that. And the thing with how a man Jesus became a god, I got another proposal in the signature books for a book to be called Christ Mythicism and Gospel Christology, where I want to try to reconcile that approach, which I think most New Testament scholars think, human Jesus magnified into myth, with the Christ myth theory. Jesus is a myth who becomes historicized, and I want to try to show how you can kind of fit them both together, as crazy as it sounds. So,
yeah, we had in the last Bible Geek Hangout that we had last week, that came up where you're starting with some kind of divine or mythical being who is then historicized or euhemerized, but then becomes mythical again. And we had a lot of problems wrapping our heads around that double mythologizing idea.
Well, that is the problem, but I think there's a pretty good solution on analogy with the messianic secret theory of Reda, that Mark, or his predecessor, is trying to, he stands in the middle of two rival Christologies, one of which says that Jesus became the Christ as of his resurrection, or, as John A.T. Robinson added, maybe that he wasn't the Christ yet, but would be as the second coming. Well, as time went by and nothing happened, they messianized what the only coming they had, and so the gospel, so they figured, oh yeah, it was as the Messiah that Jesus did these miracles and was crucified. That was the mission of the Messiah, because that's what we know he did. And the other group said, so you had one group that said he isn't the Messiah yet, or he became that as at the resurrection and will shortly return. The rival group saying that, oh no, he always was. Wait a minute, how can you get those two together? Well, okay, he was the Messiah, but he kept it a secret until a certain period of time. So you have the notion that he was the Messiah in secret in Mark. But in the other Gospels, the secret begins to slip until in John, he's broadcasting that he's the Son of God and so forth. So I think there's a similar sort of a bell curve thing where you have an original mythical God who, for purposes of church institutional politics, is historicized and brought down to earth because it was useful to have a historical founder to say, see, we got the real stuff here. But this human Jesus was then, they took the wraps off and they couldn't keep him human, and so from gospel to gospel he becomes more of a god again, and Docetism is the resultant compromise, where they say, all right, he was seen on earth, but he wasn't really here. So I think you can reapply the categories of the messianic secret theory and explain and reconcile the two things. You do have a growing divinity from a human Messiah in the Gospels, but that is a falling away from the initial attempt to historicize a mythic divine Christ. So that's kind of how I plan to argue it.
Okay, before I get on to maybe another question from one of the our panelists here, David, I thought just one more comment about the Ehrman book. I think what Frank Zindler was talking about, and it might have also been Doherty in the book Bart Ehrman and Quest of the Historical Jesus, was that you're automatically assuming that there was a man Jesus that at some point was divinized. So it seems like when you read Did Jesus Exist, and why I said earlier it seemed like a rehearsal for this book, is that he just basically, a good portion of the book was that, almost arguing that thesis, and was ignoring all the material that Zindler sent, all the material that you had sent about what to read and so forth. So it just seemed that, if you want to really know what was the problem with what did Jesus exist, is I don't think he really was writing the book that we thought he was going to write.
Yeah. I mean, because he certainly didn't. He was trying to educate himself in what the Christ myth theory said, but I'm not really sure he did, and he does just take it for granted, essentially. So it's I hope one day he will really interact with it, but who knows? Maybe he said his last on that.
Okay, David, if you had a question, want to type it in the chat, now would be a good time. In the meantime, Hector has another question in the chat. He has French philosopher Michel Onfray. And he has something in quite probably many other writers as cross are already seeing the advent of a post-Christian era. What shape do you see this post-Christian era is taking? So I guess he wants a little prognostication from you there.
Well, in two competing and, in my view, fatally dangerous faiths are building, and they're opposed, whether it'll ever come to blows or not. There's radical Islam, which is technically a minority of 10 to 30% of Muslims, which, if it's the latter, is a mere 300 million Muslims, the same as the population of the United States. They're going to make trouble more and more to try to return to the 7th century. And the other religious faith is politically correct liberalism. I know I get into trouble, but I've been asked my opinion. So that, I think, is the rival faith. It is, in my opinion, a fact-proof religious faith committed implausibly to a stance that is rotting out the traditional values of the West. I mean, I am a secularist in many ways. I think Sam Harris is right. It would be better not to have people believing in things with no evidence and all that. But I think that's true of the reigning liberal ideology, sad to say. I would like a conservative secularism, and I don't know that that is ever likely to happen. So I think we have, I think everything else is either dying off or becoming irrelevant. So I think it's you're going to have the devil in the deep blue sea, and we're going to be in big trouble either way. But and these things are already dangerously predominant, and traditional values. I find this very a bitter pill. Traditional values with which I agree are championed mainly by religious believers whose creeds I reject. I mean, they happen to be predisposed to traditional Western values, and they think they're tied to the Bible and so on, when I believe they are not at all. So the voice I represent is hardly heard at all and may just be engulfed. So I think the post-Christian view is the religion of liberalism and the dominance of Islam. So, yeah, it has already begun, and it is a post-Christian era.
You mentioned, isn't it, though, that, because you're only about 6 years older than me, I think, is that sometimes that reminds me when they say that, you know, that Islam is taking over, or we're going to be having Sharia law, or whatever it is. It's like I've heard that before, you know, when they were saying, you know, communism and all kinds of stuff were going to take over, and it just never happened. Sometimes I just think that there's an alarmist kind of deal, that it's hard to predict what's going to be the future.
It is, but I think that, and I agree that militant Islam is a revitalization movement, and usually when such a movement to restore the glorious past begins, it's already too late, because they're reacting in shock to modernization, westernization, secularization. But these people today are ingenious enough to have intimidated the West through political correctness. Oh, we don't want to be accused of Islamophobia. That you already have amazing voluntary concessions to these nuts by governments and society in general, just those who run educational and other institutions, not legal control necessarily, but the zeitgeist, the elan, the whole mentality now is so accommodationist toward this stuff. We don't want to offend anybody, that we're digging our own grave, and these people will eventually be allowed to like, it's just like Finlandization. It used to be when the Soviet Union was dominant, they said that Finland wasn't exactly a satellite country like the Warsaw Pact nations, but they're so close to powerful USSR that if Russia gets a cold, Finland sneezes. Well, I think there's a kind of an Islamic Finlandization that has already gone very far, and if one opposes it, one is shamed. The public discourse has been controlled by manners now, dictated by the left, to such a degree that the will of accommodationists has been sapped, and there's a lot more mischief that could be done in the name of Islam, short of all of us having to become Muslims. I don't think that's going to happen, but there's going to be a real mess. And I don't think that's alarmist. I think there are alarmist issues that are pressed by different factions to persuade people to yield control to so-called experts, and that threaten democracy, that add a fourth and fifth branch to government, the experts and the bureaucracy, and we're in jeopardy because of that. But I don't consider that alarmist. I think there are things to be alarmed about. I do think that the fear of right-wing TV preachers taking over the country, that is ludicrous alarmism, as much as I despise those people, right? I'm no fan of theirs. But the secular left that is so afraid of that, I think that's preposterous. So I think I can make a distinction. I'm not hysterical over any and every possibility, but it seems to me just look at what is happening in Europe, for instance, with Islam and unrestricted immigration and kowtowing to these people. It seems to me we are in potentially big trouble if we don't wake up.
I noticed that a lot of things that are part of your philosophy, that you agree with a lot of things that are considered liberal. It seems that what's left is that the main difference between you and the people that you're talking about is mainly political, conservative political views.
Yeah, I'd say, like, for instance, I'm all in favor of gay rights. That seems obvious to me. The equality of men and women, that is patently obvious. However, I am against abortion. I think that is an awful crime that we'll one day regret. I am not sure what I think about legalizing drugs. It might be the better course to stop cartels and gang violence and so on, but it marks, I think, a further descent into decadence. So I really don't know what to think, and there are various issues like that, but there are, liberal positions I take on some things.
Right, and I think whenever I hear any kind of disparaging of your views, it's mainly that because of your political conservatism, you seem to be automatically, at least in the minds of people, to be allied with conservative positions in other areas that you certainly don't agree with.
Yeah, it's probably so, yeah.
Anyway, we had some questions from the chat room. David Robertson was asking basically how much of the NT was created, corrupted, and how that is an underlying issue with what we assume is true about the historical Jesus. For example, the translation of the New Testament by Constantine I think that was the second part where he was clarifying it. He originally began, I'm curious how y'all feel about the evolution of the NT canon, of those manuscripts themselves, and how that influences the picture we have of Jesus. So what I read first was a follow-up on that, and I'll read it again. Basically, how much the NT was edited, corrupted, and how that is an underlying issue with what we assume is true about the historical Jesus. For example, the translation of the New Testament by Constantine.
I know this, I keep saying this, but that is a very good and insightful question, and it points out three related but distinct issues there. For one thing, as Dewey Beagle once said, oh, the original manuscripts are the inerrant ones? What originals? And a lot of people have caught up with him now, saying that there is no true version of an oral or a written text. Each new version is a new performance and a new work in its own right. This becomes relevant when you talk about the various traditions that grew and were sifted and eventually written down in some form. So a lot of the distortion about a historical or a non-historical Jesus goes back into that unknown tunnel period of oral transmission, and you can even ask, was there one? But of course they like to say that there was, because it's a way of saying, okay, there was a Jesus and there is a gap between him and the written text, so there must be oral transmission to bridge it. Well, okay, I'm willing to say there was an oral period where the traditions, the rumors, the anecdotes were percolating before they got written down in various forms, like the different Gospels. Now, anything could have happened there. There's just no way to know what was suppressed, what was embellished. It's impossible to tell. The closest you can come is to rule out various passages as anachronisms and so on. I think that goes a long way towards skepticism. Okay, the traditions underlying any text. Well, how about once the texts are written and circulated, are we sure we even know what they said? Is it possible that copyists have tampered with the published manuscripts? Let's simplify that. Once they started circulating, did people begin to tinker with them and add and subtract? Well, yeah, we know they did to some degree by comparing the manuscripts we do have. But there appears to be a tunnel period there where there is no manuscript evidence. And as William O. Walker and Winsome Monroe and others have suggested, there are internal discontinuities and oddities that make it look like that if we had the manuscripts from earlier, they would look different. We wouldn't have some of these passages in there. It reads as if somebody has inserted something, and quite often. So I think there's good reason to believe that an extant text was significantly corrupted, but you can't prove it. Now, what happened with the canon selection that I agree with Trobisch probably was the work of Polycarp in the 2nd century, but was only made official 200 years later, during the time of St. Athanasius and Constantine and so on. That was a major suppression of the documents of other types of Christianity, Gnosticism, the Ebionites, and so on. And if that had survived, our views of Jesus might look a good bit different. We might just be choosing between a lot of fictions, right? That could equally be. But you would have a range of views of Jesus that you don't quite have now. And so, yeah, there's been funny business and embellishment and redaction and exclusion at every stage of the game. The oral period, the tampering with the texts once there were written texts, and then the suppression and selection of texts in the formative period in the first few centuries. And it's hard to know what any original in any sense would look like.
It seems a common misperception. I would suppose it would be a way to characterize it that Constantine basically gave us the Bible, or as David said, he wrote it. That's a common misperception. Could you go over that issue?
Yeah, there is a point to that, because whether it was Constantine himself, at least St. Athanasius, who was an ally of his, did attempt to restrict the use of Christian books to the 27 we have today, and Trobisch makes it very likely that that particular edition was the work of Polycarp 200 years earlier. But that was only one of various competing editions, and that Athanasius said, he sent around this Easter letter in 367 to the churches and monasteries saying, okay, this is it. Here's the books we're using for the New Testament. Don't use any other ones. And once the monks at the monastery of St. Pachomius in Nag Hammadi got this, they said, uh-oh, what about the dialogue of the Savior and the Gospel of Mary and stuff like this? What do we do? Because the next time a messenger of Athanasius comes around, he's not going to want to see those books. They're probably going to get burned. Well, let's store them away. Eventually, maybe somebody will get some use out of them. And, of course, they were discovered in 1945. So that kind of thing did happen, so that there were books ejected from circulation, from use by the Constantinian establishment. And the implication of that sort of justifies the common claim that Christians once believed in reincarnation, but Constantine censored that from the Bible. Well, there is a point to that. It's crudely stated. But there were Gnostic texts that did have the teaching of reincarnation, and these are the ones that were kicked out or that were excluded. We're not having those in the New Testament. So, yeah, there is a point to that, but the Council of Nicaea didn't deal with that issue, and it wasn't settled until some years later. I think about 40 years later, Athanasius' letter went out. And even then, manuscripts show that it was a long time before people took that seriously. Even the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus, that are thought perhaps to be among the copies that Constantine had copied and sent to the bishops, even these two have like the Epistle of Barnabas, First Clement, stuff like that, that weren't in Athanasius's list. And for a long time, you got all kinds of other stuff in there. It takes a long time before everybody really marched lockstep with that. So, yeah, it's kind of true, but it's just so oversimplified, it's a bit distorted.
How large was the canon in the time of Polycarp? Did it already encompass more or less the 27 canonical books?
Well, from early, like canon lists shortly after him, like from Origen and the Muratorian canon and so forth, it was basically the same bunch, but like everybody, at least in that corner of the church, would accept the four Gospels, though there were some voices rejecting John as a Gnostic text. They didn't prevail, but everybody pretty much had the four Gospels, the book of Acts, the Pauline epistles, though of course Marcionites had fewer. They most had James, 1 John, and 1 Peter. But these shorter ones, and later ones, a lot of people had simply never heard of if they had existed at all by that time. And the book of Revelation was a problem, and Hebrews was a problem. The East kind of liked Hebrews, but the West didn't, because it was so severe against people that it had chickened out in a time of persecution. You're crucifying the Son of God to yourself. You forget it, buddy. You're out of here. The West didn't like that because it's like the Donatist controversy. How rough you want to be on people that chickened out. The East apparently didn't mind that so much. The West liked the book of Revelation, which the East thought was crazy. And so it was about 600 AD when somehow they all came to the conclusion, well, if you'll accept Hebrews, we'll accept Revelation. But that was, again, accepting Polycarp's 27 book canon. But it's just, in his circles, there might not have been a whole lot of dispute. Again, secondary, whoever heard it was 2nd John, 3rd John, they're like notepad pages. Whoever heard of this? And eventually, well, look, it looks like the same guy that wrote 1st John. Okay, what the heck? But then Eusebius tells us that there were a lot more books, even in his day, that were being bounced around. He said there are some that, not much wrong with them, like the Shepherd of Hermas, the Gospel according to the Hebrews, but many people don't accept them, some do. Then there are books that he called heretical forgeries that are Gnostic and so forth. They even though they claim to be by apostles, they can't be. And most of my crowd rejects that. And so forth. So even in his day, there was still a lot of diversity of opinion on it, even though Polycarp's, if Trobisch is right, Polycarp's edition gained ground and eventually became the official list.
Thank you for that answer, Dr. Price. I hope that answered some of David's questions. Hector had a follow-up question. He said, would that tidbit about Athanasius account for the idea that Nicaea was about the canon?
I'm guessing it would, but it couldn't have been dealt with there because Eusebius is writing after that, and he says there's still a lot of these things up for grabs, and so I don't know if he had anything to do with Athanasius on this score, though they must have known each other. Since it is the Constantine establishment that's involved, I think that probably is why people make this understandable confusion and figure, oh, it must have been done at the big business meeting. Wouldn't have been surprising either, but that's not what happened.
I was wondering, Rabob, did you have a question or a comment?
I think we'll call it quits, okay?
Good to hear your voice again.
Yes, no question.
Oh, boy. Like the old days.
Thank you, Robert. Ruben typed in a question from a friend of his. It says, Dr. Price, a friend of mine recently asked for a recommended reading list of 5 to 10 books that are essential for any Bible geek to read. Could you condense your recommended reading list that you have on mindvendor.com to 5 or 10 books? Thanks in advance.
Let's see, I would certainly recommend David Friedrich Strauss's The Life of Jesus, Critically Examined. Also, F.C. Bauer's Paul the Apostle of Jesus Christ, which has been reprinted in the last few years as a single volume from Hendrickson Publishers. That's a fundamental work. I'd also recommend this book that Ed Suomen and I just put together, The English Writings of W.C. van Manen, a book called A Wave of Hypercriticism. That's really mind-blowing, suggesting that Paul wrote none of the letters attributed to him. I think another great one is Bultmann's History of the Synoptic Tradition. Another is Bultmann's The Gospel of John, his commentary, which is just incredibly good. I would add Charles H. Talbert, What is a Gospel? About the genre of Gospels and the similarity to sacred biographies of immortals and so on in the Hellenistic world. I really love Geza Vermesh's book, Jesus the Jew. I don't agree with a good bit of it, but it's just enormously interesting. Let's see.
Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, I would recommend.
No, that's a great one. Yeah, yeah. And boy, there's so many goodies. It's an embarrassment of riches. John, Jesus. There are a bunch of more recent ones that I don't think mark much of an advance. In the way of New Testament minimalism, Burton Mack's book, A Myth of Innocence, Mark and Christian Origins, is really terrific, far beyond just the Gospel of Mark focus. And, let's see. Maybe Kurt Rudolph, which I think is Rudolph. I could be wrong. Usually Germans have it with an F, but Kurt Rudolph's Gnosis, which is the definitive book on Gnosticism. Oh, yeah, and another great one, Walter Bauer's Orthodoxy and Heresy in Earliest Christianity. I don't know how many we're up to here, but Albert Schweitzer's The Quest of the Historical Jesus, that is filled with interesting information you'll never find elsewhere.
Especially the version that's been re-released, which has additional chapters where he deals with the historical Jesus question of his day.
Terrific, yeah. That makes me think of, think Price. Almost had it there. Another great one is The Hellenistic Mystery Religions by Richard Reitzenstein. I don't know how easy that is to find anymore, but it's Reitzenstein, Reitzenstein. He's terrific. That's a major book on a major area, and he deals with the similarities and asks which way did the influence go, and shows that it's much more likely Christianity absorbed the influence of these people rather than the other way around. Let's see. Well, another classic, and probably beyond 10, would be R.H. Charles's Eschatology, which is kind of dated but still fascinating in terms of the different strands of apocalyptic thought in the early Christian period.
What was the name of that book by Ronald McDonald about Homer and its influence?
That's a great one too. I believe it's the Gospel of Mark and the Homeric Epics, but I'm never sure. It could be the Homeric Epics and the Gospel of Mark, or he could just call it Homeric Epics and Mark's Gospel. I can't remember, but if you looked up Dennis Ronald MacDonald, M-A-C, I believe it is, on Amazon, you'd immediately spot it, even though I can.
Oh, that's right, Dennis Ronald MacDonald. I'm sorry.
Yeah, or sometimes he's just now Dennis R. MacDonald, but he goes under both.
Another one that was mentioned because it was misunderstood, I think they were just going by the title of it, is a relatively recent work, The Messiah Myth by Thomas L. Thompson. I thought that was a very good read.
Yeah, it is fascinating. I find it a little disappointing in terms of making a case that Jesus was a myth, but it is filled with fascinating stuff nonetheless, especially that issue of birth oracles that are mistaken as messianic prophecies.
I didn't think his intent was to prove any kind of mythicist stance, but rather to show the myth itself of a Messiah had its roots in Jewish and also Near Eastern, not necessarily Hebrew. roots. So I thought that was interesting.
Well, yeah, he makes it. It's kind of about the sacred king mythology, but I believe he does go on to say there's no reason to believe that these motifs of the royal ideology and so on ever came to earth in the form of a historical figure. I remember taking him to task in a review, now a chapter of the historical bejesus, that we know that certain people eventually came forward claiming to be the Messiah, like Simon Bar Kokhba. What did if he could have done it, there could have been a Jesus who did it too. And he does seem to argue that there wasn't a Jesus, but I even though that's what I think, I don't believe the argument is compelling. I don't think there is much of an argument, but still, it's well worth reading. And the guy is just an incredible scholar and a good writer to read. I mean, he's got a real gift stylistically too.
Both Reuven and Hector both wrote in its Homeric Epics and the Gospel of Mark by Dennis R. McDonald.
Thanks, yeah.
I have a few other books by him. One was Christianizing Homer, The Odyssey, Plato, and the Acts of Andrew, which is an earlier work, I think, which kind of led up to that. And Does the New Testament Imitate Homer? 4 Cases from the Acts of the Apostles was another good one. So.
Mm-hmm.
He's been on that theme for quite a few books now.
Yeah, oh yeah, and there's more than that even.
I'm listening to my friend's broadcast. Sorry, Kenny.
About the Messiah business, a really great epic work is He That Cometh by Sigmund Mowinckel. That is just terrific in terms of the various origins, Iranian mythology, as well as the Hebrew religion, just all kinds of stuff. The sacred king motif, that's just a mind blower. I recommend that if anybody's at all interested in that topic. Again, he asked me to shrink the list. Here I go growing it, but if it's possible to get this book, and it seems to be just incredibly rare for some reason, Maurice Casey's book, Is John's Gospel True?, is just terrific. He just dispenses with a lot of the silly things said about it by critics and apologists alike. That's a terrific one.
Well, thank you for the list, Dr. Price. I'm sure we did probably 20. Before we move on, I think Doug has one last question, I think, and then we'll call it quits. I just wanted to mention that for Doug's sake, the color coding that I was doing for the source criticism of the Old Testament, where I was using the King James Version to put in Eisfeldt's division of the sources, I also included the book of Jeremiah with its sources according to Sigmund Mowinckel too. So, yeah, quite an exciting time that was.
Man.
So, Doug, you have a question for Dr. Price.
Yeah, actually, it's funny you mentioned that because that was kind of what my question was relating to. I just wanted to get your take, Dr. Price, on. There's a lot of scholars that have kind of taken their own direction off of, I forget the Wellhausen's kind of documentary hypothesis in, some differences in how they're labeling the text, whether it's, JED or P sources. What do you think about just the rich variety of how scholars are labeling the sources and how scientific you feel the methodology is in labeling these sources overall?
Well, do you have in mind some of these people that just dump the whole JEDP theory, or people that are just reassigning bits and pieces of it to the different sources?
Yeah, kind of just reassigning it. Because, for example, John was showing us some of the text coloring he was doing with the Septuagint stuff, and I mean, it looked like to me that some of the coloring was just even a couple words sometimes. And I was just wondering, like, how do they classify, just maybe a phrase or two as definitively, or maybe it's not definitively, or maybe just probably one source versus the other. I know in some cases, depending on whether or not they're using Elohim or Yahweh, that could be a sign, but I'm just wondering overall how that methodology kind of works essentially, and why there's a lot of variety depending on which scholar you're using.
I think the way it's done is, of course, there are the big clusters of things, like you mentioned, the which divine name, and also signature traits of different sources, like the priestly writer tends to be incredibly redundant, and to use phrases like I make a covenant with you, or calling God El Shaddai. I believe he's the only one that does that, though he uses Elohim as well. And he is careful to distinguish periods of revelation, like in his flood story. Noah doesn't know the difference between kosher and non-kosher animals, because he couldn't. That arrived only with Moses, according to the priestly writer. But Jay has Noah draw that distinction because he's just sloppy and anachronistic. So there are things like this. Or if you have two similar stories, like the patriarch lying about his wife being his sister, there are three versions of that. Two of them are J versions, one about Abram and the other Isaac. They couldn't keep straight who was the star of the thing. But E has Abraham, and E tries to improve the image of Abraham. He has Abraham not just plain lying. The way he works it out, Sarah is sort of a relative, a cousin or something, so he's just stretching the truth. Nobody else mentions that. He has Abraham protest when Sarah wants to kick Hagar and baby Ishmael out onto the street. Whereas in J, let him go, just shut up about it. He seems much more crass. And so you see this tendency to clean up the characters in E. E seems to have northern locales more than J does, who's in the south, in Judah. And so once you can see that these things cluster, and you can, not every one is present in every story, but there's this definite, extensive pattern, that kind of settles it. But the other things where you have not any of those things, if in the sections where you do find them, you can begin to determine what was the favorite or characteristic vocabulary of those writers, and you see that popping up in some of these phrases and sentences that are otherwise unidentifiable, it's a pretty safe bet that it's I don't know which if this is a good vocabulary case or a stylistic one, but Deuteronomy calls the Canaanites the Amorites. So stuff like that, you begin to look for the standard usage of these writers, even when the big signals aren't flashing. But even doing that, it seems like it remains hypothetical, and so there is legitimate room for doubt. Like from what I've read, the whole story of Abraham fighting alongside the king of Sodom to get Lot back out of being a hostage, I don't think anybody knows what source that is. There's just not enough. Maybe it's a whole different one. It's not clear at all. And there's some other bigger or smaller chunks where there's no telling. I think, however, that like there are places like the flood stories where you follow the main markers and you can tell what a lot of the stuff must be, J or P, and then there are a number of sentences that you probably can't tell even from the vocabulary, but you begin to allot the redundant parts to one or the other and see if they make a connected narrative. And so you're like putting jigsaw puzzle pieces together. And I think that one's pretty straightforward because you can come up with two continuous flood stories, neither of which is missing a word, or the two versions of Jacob's ladder, that vision. There's a J and an E version of that, and you can neatly slice them together verse by verse, and you got two self-contained stories. So sometimes it's just which phrases would fit the sentences that we know we have to have in J or E. So that's some of what I think is going on there, and even at that, sometimes you can't know, and so there are going to be differences.
Thank
Probably
you.
not awake after that.
Doug, I just put in a link to a book that we were discussing last week. That's Otto Eisfeld's book, The Old Testament, an Introduction. I'm going to go ahead and look at that because in order for somebody to do that atomistically, dividing it, I wanted to reread some of the stuff about his reasons for, being that specific, where he could break a particular verse into two or even more sources. So maybe that might be a good thing for the next Hangout. I might do a little bit of research on that for you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'll look into that book as well.
This is one interesting, though oblique hint, is that you can do that with gospel harmonies, at least on the model of the Q mark thing. And when you have the sources in front of you, you can tell, what do you know? Luke has added this. Matthew didn't, but he added this. And you can begin to get a feel for their characteristic ideas and vocabulary and say, this sounds like a Lucan phrase to me. And so it's interesting to see if you could do the same sort of thing, reverse engineering with the Pentateuch. And I guess maybe they're doing that. I don't know.
I think a lot of the modern scholars criticize the older scholars for their reliance on the linguistic evidence, where one of the arguments against it is that can you really say a particular word or a phrase belongs to a certain source and it's a characteristic of that source, when just about everything you can at least think of a few examples of some other source that might have been using the same terminology and stuff. So that's one of the newer criticisms of it that I know of.
That's true, but that, in my opinion, just shows why there is a kind of a fringe where it's equivocal. But I think often you can find those patterns, like again in the Gospels. There's no denying that Matthew uses the kingdom of heaven and must have substituted it for kingdom of God, which appears in the other synoptics, though a couple of times, like Goodacre says, there must have been editorial fatigue because he forgot to change it, and you've got kingdom of God a couple of times. But I don't think just because you can find an example or two elsewhere doesn't really buck the trend. You'd have to explain, why is it usually this way? Why is the most evidence on this side? But if there's really no trend, well, then I don't know why anybody would say there is, but I don't believe usually the arguments run that way. I mean, it would obviously be stupid to say, well, the pastoral epistles use this word, that must be distinctive. Hey, wait a minute, I found it in Romans, Galatians, Colossians, and so on. Well, yeah, that would be stupid. But if you can find, as you can, a whole lot of vocabulary in the pastorals that is not paralleled but once or twice in the earlier Pauline epistles, but have loads of parallels in the apostolic fathers, that tells me something. I can't just dismiss that.
You mentioned harmonies and so forth. I was just doing this. I was looking at the 5 Gospel Parallels website where they use little tokens in the text, and you click on it and it takes you to the parallel part in the other Gospels. I thought, well, I could probably recreate that, so I was doing an experiment. And I'm looking at the similarities between the angel's encounter with Mary and Luke, and the angel's dream. I believe it was a dream where he appears to Joseph. And I'm going through this, and I'm looking at things like Matthew had been betrothed to, and Luke betrothed to Joseph, a man, and then Luke, a man whose name was Joseph. So I'm going through there, and there's all these similarities where you can match up an angel, the angel saying, said to Joseph, her, do not fear to take, don't be afraid, Mary, your wife, for that which is, for we have found favor with God, and behold, you will conceive in your womb. So there's this parallel where the story is almost where Luke has rewritten Matthew's account and just made it from the perspective of Mary, which some people would say, like Goodacre, well, that shows dependency of Luke directly on Matthew. But I'm thinking, okay, well, in just this instance, this could have been added much later, this infancy narrative or pre-infancy narrative. And it was based on Luke, but it was not part of Luke's original gospel.
Right, yeah. You have that, I think, all the time between Luke and John. There are a surprising number of things that occur in both and are not in the synoptics, the other synoptics, and some of them kind of look like John is borrowing from Luke, but others look like Luke is borrowing from John, and probably both the case. I think that you had both texts growing in dialogue with the other. A scribe would say, hey, I kind of like that thing, and John, let me include it in here. And later, Johannine scribe is looking at that version of Luke saying, oh, hey, what about this? I ought to respond to that. So that could well be subsequent stages of borrowing.
Yeah, there was. I was in a discussion with another Bible geek. Maybe it was about 2 years ago, and I was going through the first chapter of Luke, and I thought I saw some kind of seam where, if you had thought that the Gospel of Luke really was about John the Baptist, there seems to be a sudden break where it suddenly goes into Mary and her story, and then back to Elizabeth and things that happen with John again. It almost seemed like if you just assume that was interpolated, you could just eliminate that, and it reads as a very good story about the Messiah, John the Baptist.
Yeah, especially in the, was it the Nunc Dimittis or something, the Zechariah's canticle. He says that his son will be the scion of the house of David. Wait a minute, that's John the Baptist. What are you talking about? Yeah, maybe this was a piece of material from the John sect that thought John was the Messiah.
And I thought all that material neatly kind of congregated on both sides where I thought there might have been a break, but I'll have to go through it again and look at it again to see where, and maybe whip it up as a Bible Geek question for the podcast or something.
Well, you certainly do have two continuous stories, a nativity of John, a nativity of Jesus, and then a few bridge verses, like when the mothers meet and all that. But a lot of people have thought that, yeah, what we have here is material from the John the Baptist sect, and partly based on the Samuel nativity, and then the Jesus sect also, their nativity based partly on Samuel, and that Luke is trying to do the same thing you see in Acts with Peter and Paul paralleled. They're trying to bring together the Johannine sectarians and the Christians by showing, hey, look, if you think Jesus is the Messiah because of this, you got pretty much the same thing with John. He must be okay. You John sectarians, don't you see how similar Jesus' story is? You got to like him if you like your guy. And so he may have been the one that split it up and pasted it together, or might be a later scribe. I don't think it's ever going to be possible to know, but I think you are right. Somebody has spliced things together.
I thank you for that. I think we should call it quits. We've been going on for a while now. I'm talked out. I'm sure Dr. Price is too. So I thank you, Dr. Price, and for everybody that's been listening and everybody that's participating especially. Thank you for your great questions. I appreciate it.
You know, one day this one day might just become the Bible Geek.
It'd be a return to the glory days of the Infidel Guys show.
Yeah.
Of course, I'd never heard of you at that time, so I never participated or heard any of that going on, only in recordings.
Yeah, maybe we can go back to that format.
Yeah, because I've basically insinuated myself into your life, so why not keep going? Why not
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, sounds good to me.
All righty, thank you very much. Reuven, you can take us off live now, I imagine.